This is probably going to be the last time I feature an apology in these videos for not following my own self-imposed schedule. The sheer volume of material I have to look at, combined with the obligations and busy schedules of both myself and my editor, means that it really doesn't do me or you, the viewer, any good to keep worrying about when I'll get to requests. Trust that they'll happen eventually, and beyond that, just try to enjoy whatever I can manage to scrape together. It's still relevant to talk about this movie, for instance, and boy do I have some thoughts about it. If that feels like a rushed effort to clean a busy slate, then that's actually appropriate, since that sums up the first 20 or so minutes of Thor Ragnarok. The character, or rather the director and screenwriters, were left in a tough spot after the previous Thor film. The Dark World wasn't all that well received, and yet ended with the status quo that pretty much demanded that whatever came next be at least partially about that. Clearly, though, that's not the story that the MCU wanted to tell with Ragnarok, so the first act is dedicated almost entirely to systematically wiping away all the things stopping a third Thor film from standing largely on its own. The boring love interest of the first two films and all her baggage is done away with in a single dialogue exchange. The Loki pretending to be Odin cliffhanger is resolved within a scene. Odin himself is taken off the playing field not that long afterward. The Warriors 3 are unceremoniously axed. And the quest for the Infinity Stones that we set up at the end of Age of Ultron is tossed aside within literally the first minute of the film. It's with the arrival of the new villain Hela that the cleanup for Thor the Dark World ends and Thor Ragnarok truly begins, aka the best Thor film, aka a fun little movie that feels like it's missing something. It's possible that may change as I noodle on the movie more, but Ragnarok just didn't resonate with me the way its immediate predecessors in the MCU have. Every movie we've gotten between this and Ant-Man has pretty much been an instant favorite of mine. While this is a movie that feels like it's firing on all cylinders, if that fire is, more of a smoldering fire. I'm losing the metaphor. Look, let's just take this point by point, starting with what everyone praises the film for most, the humor. As far as the yucks went, I was honestly expecting a greater volume of gags than what we got based on what people have been saying about this film. That it's a flat-out comedy, that it's just a big romp, that the humor is ever-present to the point of being nearly distracting, etc., etc. But the amount of jokes didn't feel as all-encompassing as comments like that made me expect. There were quite a few moments with no jokes at all, and the tension, when it's present, is genuine. I don't have a problem with there not being as many jokes as I expected, not by a long shot. I do think it's worth noting, though, that this movie probably got the least belly laughs from me out of the last several MCU films. Civil War was almost a dirge for much of its runtime, but I remember laughing more at the lighter moments that were present in that movie than I did at the majority of Ragnarok. I don't think any of the jokes were real clunkers, thankfully, but most of them just kinda passed through me. I absolutely do have to give them credit for the sheer number of unexpected callback jokes. Most of the gags that made me laugh hard were the ones that were calling back to previous films, particularly a music cue early in the film that got me real good. Speaking of humor, Chris Hemsworth gets to stretch his considerable comedic chops here more than he has previously, but in spite of that, I didn't quite agree with the appraisal that this movie somehow adds a layer of charisma to the character that wasn't there before. I've always liked Thor, but I completely understand the opinion that he was the least compelling of the core Avengers, or at least the one that the franchise didn't quite seem to know what to do with. Ragnarok feels like a bit of a new take on the character, but it's not like Thor is suddenly my favorite lead in these films or anything. Thankfully, though, this is the first time he's been the lead of a film that wasn't subsequently stolen by his brother. Loki gets a lot to do, and he and Thor's relationship is the crux of the film in some ways, but for once outside of the first Avengers film, he gets to be in a movie where other characters are written just as well as he is. Really, though, there are very few members of the cast that are actually massive scene stealers, and while that's probably for the best, since unlike Civil War, this plays more like a single character journey than an ensemble piece, word of mouth had me expecting Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie to completely run away with the movie. She's a compelling, well-played character with a nice arc, don't get me wrong, but I'm not quite jumping out of my seat to see a Valkyrie movie the same way I was amped for Black Panther or Spider-Man's movies after, oh hey, there's Civil War again. Or how I felt like Black Widow and Hulk stole much of the first Avengers. Speaking of Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner, finally picking up with him was reason enough for me to watch this movie, and he's handled quite well. The plan, according to Marvel, is to make this the first in a trilogy of sorts where Bruce and Hulk will have their own arc in the background of bigger conflicts. Given where we end with the character in this film, that feels absolutely true, and I'm eager to see what happens next, now that we've really had a profound shift in the Banner-Hulk relationship take place in Ragnarok. I did say that the movie had a couple of scene stealers, and if you hadn't already guessed, those gotta be Jeff Goldblum as the Grandmaster, and director Taika Waititi himself as Rock Monster Korg. What can I tell you about the former that won't be accomplished just by letting you know that he enters the story with an honest-to-God Willy Wonka reference? He's completely nonsensical, and Goldblum sucks up every ounce of attention through delivery alone. Korg also delivers his lines perfectly, and he has a lot of the best dialogue bits in the film. Although once or twice his jokes are the ones that come closest to dragging me out of the story. At this point on my channel, you should know that I'm always keen to combat the stigma that Marvel has weak villains, but I've gotta say I think Hela has resonated with me the least out of all the Phase 3 baddies. Cate Blanchett looks great in the role, she has great body language and line delivery, all of which really suits what she is relative to Thor. I just can't quite get any nuance out of her. There's debatably an in-story reason why that's the case, granted that she was literally created for the purpose of war and death, but she's one of those villains that's more straightforward and simple, and coming off of baddies as complex or sympathetic as Vulture, Zemo, Caecilius, Ego, and Ultron, she's a bit of a letdown. Honestly, I feel like across-the-board reception of her captures the sort of polarizing reception to this movie as a whole. I've heard her called the best MCU villain by some and a complete waste of potential by others. I'm sadly leaning more toward the second one, but I am in the middle. On paper, her backstory is honestly kinda tragic, but the movie doesn't really bring it to the fore or let Blanchett play beyond a condescending bitterness. Her impromptu sidekick Scourge is way more interesting if I'm being honest, especially since I went into the movie thinking that he would be a complete nothing of a role. We've also got another Marvel hero making an appearance in this film in the form of Doctor Strange, and he's yet another microcosm of what does and doesn't work about the movie in my opinion. His appearance is fun and funny, but his function in the plot is so minor that it really could have been accomplished in any other number of ways. I'm glad he's here, but I'm wary of having this kind of inclusion if the character isn't at least going to be more of a substantial supporting role. The fact that you can say a literal magical sorcerer superhero simply pops in and out of the film like it was nothing fits the whacked-out, spacey-wacy gonzo presentation of the whole picture, and I like that there's enough character in the little snippet we get of him that you can tell how much he's grown and changed from the end of his own movie. But I personally would have given him more material because as he is now, he's just a plot device to get characters from point A to point B, in a sequence so rushed that it's over just when he and the other characters start to establish a dynamic. It's definitely not the role I would have given him or the one I was hoping he'd play based on either the trailers or the post-credit scene of his movie. I suppose it's also time to finally talk about the one-eyed elephant in the room, that being Odin. I initially came out of Ragnarok legitimately thinking that it may have ruined the character of Odin for me and cemented him as the most poorly handled character in any MCU film. But thinking on it more, I think Ragnarok actually does a lot, though it's incredibly subtle, to clarify the type of man Odin really was all along, and to not only square that with his sort of inconsistent portrayal in the first two movies, but also really earn the idea in this one that Thor eventually ascends past his level. Looking at the movie this way bolsters Thor's own arc by quite a lot, and makes me really glad that I came to this conclusion before this video got posted so I don't look like an idiot. However, it also highlights what I still feel like is a huge remaining weakness, and that's not necessarily that the film is too subtle with its own ideas, but that Thor himself just doesn't weigh in enough, if at all, on how he feels about some of the things that happen across the movie. No matter how much I like the themes present both with Odin and the Sakaar plotline, namely dismantling oppressive systems that make people into tools of destruction, and how Thor plays into both, Thor himself could have used a bit more emotional stake by really acknowledging all that he's lost verbally in a way that isn't played as a gag. With what we have, though, I think it does do a fascinating job at looking at the one idea that's been following Thor throughout all of these movies, namely kingship, and serving as a thematic bookends for the first two movies, even if it is still a little awkward that this movie and even interviews make it seem like no one involved really wished they were making another Thor movie. Come to think of it, is it just going to be the trend with Marvel that all of their proper trilogies have really great thematic bookends even if the third part is almost completely divorced from the first in terms of genre and plot? On the technical level, one of the best things about the film is the visual presentation. The set design on the Grandmaster's planet Sakaar is great, and there are certain scenes or even just certain shots that are amazingly well done, particularly a shot pertaining to Bruce and Hulk and a flashback sequence centered around Valkyrie. Honestly, some moments of cinematography are just The more time passes, the more Marvel graces us with films that capture perfectly the visual appeal of comic books, as well as just highlighting how far we've come in our tolerance for weird concepts and characters in our mainstream blockbusters. The action is alright, I guess. Nothing overly creative, but at least the movie never overindulges either. The fights are serviceable, in what I guess was an aspect of the previous two films this movie just couldn't shake. The more I think about it, the more I think maybe Thor is just a difficult character to choreograph really awesome, memorable action scenes around. Mark Mothersbaugh provides a great musical score which manages to simultaneously sound completely unique, but also feature returning motifs or musical callbacks to previous scores in other MCU films. It always makes me happy when Marvel avoids their usual approach of junking themes or leitmotifs between movies, and this film really goes all out. Doctor Strange's musical flavor accompanies his cameo, that really funny musical cue I mentioned earlier is in reference to the Dark World, the original film's theme by Patrick Doyle gets called back to, and bits of the Age of Ultron score come back when appropriate too. It's great! This review sounds like a decidedly mixed bag, and I think that's where I'm standing on this movie as a whole. Thor Ragnarok feels like a passion project that really suffers from its approach to the baggage of previous movies. It feels kinda weird not to love an MCU film as much, if not more, than the majority, and I hope it's one of those movies that gets better for me with repeat viewings, but after a first watch, it feels like it would end up around the lower third of my Cubematic Universe rankings. It's not a bad movie, and when it's done digging itself out of the corner the last film left it in, what does work about it keeps it from being even just okay. The problem is that the thematic soul of the movie is not broken, but definitely cracked. It feels like a movie caught at a crossroads. It tries to be both a passion project by a director who doesn't seem remotely interested in Thor's mythos or supporting cast, and a bookends to the themes and motifs of the first two films, and it can't quite pull both of those things off. In what I maintain has been the best year on record for superhero movies, Thor Ragnarok unfortunately pales next to the competition.